Greetings friends and welcome to the old world. I'm Lorcan and this is OnlyWar. So Games Workshop dropped their latest tidbit of old world news over the holidays, and while showing off the Bretonnians, we actually got a lot of information that really allows us to nail down what time period the old world will be set to close to a few decades. In this video we'll look at the evidence for the time setting for the old world, then do a quick roundup of what some of the famous faces of fantasy are getting up to if they were alive then. So let's start off with the obvious and the highlighted Bretonnians. We see the heraldry for King Lewin Orcslayer. He was king in 2201, started the errantry wars against the orcs that led to the reclaiming of land and the foundations of city fortresses along the borders. Okay, sorry. Serious Bretonnian music. King Lewin Orcslayer amassed a grand army after declaring his errantry war. Thousands of young knights joined the ranks of the army, smashing the growing orc and goblin forces that had been amassing on the borders of Bretonnia. The traditional borders of the dukedoms were expanded and many greenskin strongholds conquered. New castles built along those borders and many of the young knights errants were granted these domains along with full knightly title at the end of the years of war. But that still only narrows us down to Lewin's expansionist reign and the associated greenskin genocide. Details are patchy on how long that is, so we'll need something else. Before we do that, we'll mention the other Bretonnians who will be about. So Bretonnia get King Lewin, no not that one, possibly as a well-established king towards the end of his reign as we'll see shortly. Duke Maldred of Mousillon will attempt to seize the crown in 2297 in the affair of the False Grail. He's possibly but not likely in power. The Fey Enchantress will be around. She is in effect a perpetual, being reincarnated each time her mortal form wears out or something. May not be going by Morgana Le Fay as she's had several names over the centuries. The Green Knight? Possibly. He's being the final boss on Grail quests at this point, so yeah, why not? Okay, so what other evidence? It's our tree-hugging elves that may narrow the date for us. There's a Wood Elves enclave in the Forest of Arden. Now Arden was deadly in the early 2020s due to Morga the Corrupt, known as Morga the Shadow gave to the humans. In 2231 there was a great wailing amongst the trees of the Glade of Woe, and Ariel knew that Morga was off his respawn timer. Her scouts located him in the Forest of Arden, and the Mage Queen dispatched an army to murder Morga while he was still suckling on his beast mama's teat. So it was that Araloth, Lord of Talcian, and Nalith the Prophetess, led many warrior kinlads on the hunt. But old Araloth was far too much of an eager beaver, got lured into a trap and had to beat a hasty retreat from the forest. Like an episode of the original Star Trek, only named characters got out of that away mission. So Neath, Araloth and a handful of others escaped. Araloth wanted straight back in and assembled a bigger host of as many elves as the plot required, but Morka also appears to have grown up pretty fast on that beast mama milk, so promptly buggers off, leaving Araloth a bit miffed. Morka once again reappears in the Forest of Arden, and once again Araloth rushes off to find him. Armed with the required number of elves, he passed overland through Bretonnia, concealing themselves from dim-witted shite-covered peasants and slightly less shite-covered nobles alike by the means of a sorcerous mist. They arrived at the Forest of Arden to find it heavy with corrupting magic. The elves are torn limb from limb by vines, and poisonous mutated woodland creatures assail them like Snow White on a bad acid trip. Araloth then finds Morga at an outdoor rave, minding his own business and dancing on a rock, and proceeds to shoot him and throw acid in his face. Because good guys. Ariel had gifted Araloth a gourd of sap harvested from the Oak of Ages, and he flung the contents into Morga's face, setting him on fire. A great pyre was lit in the centre of the glade, so evidence of their war crimes was destroyed as they left the forest. Not all the sap had been used on poor Morga, and now it was placed at a drop of each corrupted tree as the Wood Elves passed, bringing a purifying fire to the vegetation. So in summary, the Forest of Arden is an absolute corrupted shithole, crammed to the brim with all manner of twisted beasties until about 2247, when Morga is slain. After that they can have their enclave there, but not likely before. With King Lewin, no not that one, a regular human, he'd be likely getting on a bit by this point, easily heading north of 70. So we've got our most likely date around 2250 for this map reveal. Of the other named Wood Elves, Orion is an elf chosen to be the consort king for Ariel, but he's sort of an annual thing. The day before the vernal equinox, the elf chosen to be the new king of the Wild Hunt is garlanded with flowers and painted with mystical sigils, before on the first day of spring, Ariel awakens and Orion is reborn. which is handy because the previous Orion burns out in winter. So Ariel gets a new boy toy to turn into half-rutting stag who only lasts a year as her consort through all his rutting and hunting. Oh, and his hunt occasionally spills out of the forest and slaughters truckloads of peasants. But let's be honest, by now, even they probably barely notice. Everyone's favourite raised-filled conifer, Durthu, is stomping orcs that have been driven out by King Lewin's greenskin genocide into jelly, so nothing much changes there. Nistra and Arathan, the Sisters of Twilight, are acting protecting Pine Crags from beastmen and orcs. So what about the elves that do shave their legs? The high ones. By 2250 we are getting close to a century into Finnabar's reign as Phoenix King. Prior to ascending the throne, Finnabar of Easthain has spent 50 years wandering the old world on a sort of grand tour and discovered mankind's rapid progress and nascent power. He's also rediscovered Athel Loren and the wood elves of that former frontier province, so he's quite the overachiever. Having returned from the old world with his codpiece literally bulging with old world knowledge potatoes, he immediately uses his influence to persuade aging High King Bel Hathor to open up Lotharen, the largest sea city port of the High Elves, to human merchants. When Bel Hathor passed, in accordance with his wishes, Finnabar was elected Phoenix King. It seems he didn't quite settle down as quickly as would have been prudent and continued his travels in the early years of his reign, causing the political hotbed of gossip that was the High Elf court to grind into gear and a few subtle plots hatching before the Everqueen, Alarielle, put them back in their boxes with a good old-fashioned woman-shaming. So what about Tyrion and Teklus? As you'd expect, they're busy boys. They first appear as precocious elf possible youths in 2173. In the Siege of the Holy Flame, sees Tyrion and Teklus defeat the Keeper of Secrets Nkari at the Shrine of Assyrian, putting an end to the demon's quest to end the bloodline of Anarion, to which they belong. This was back in the days when elves killed cow-headed monstrosities instead of giving them high fives and asking if they'd like to tag along to the next realm fight. In 2253, an alliance of High and Wood Elves defeat war herds of Morgrak at Athel Loren. This is dubbed the Slaughter at Bleak Meadow, as Athel Loren is beset by a beastman war herd, probably all stirred up by the war crimes of the last few decades. Spotting his opportunity to strengthen ties with the woodland elf variant, Finnabar sends a force commanded by Prince Eldria and Ystrana, High Handmaiden of Avalorn, who fight alongside Old Mate Araloth and the famed scout Sarlach the Wanderer. Although victory was achieved, Morgrak escaped, and despite a newfound respect between the elvish factions, they were little closer. We won't hear much then from Tyrion and Teklus until 2301 and the Great Chaos Incursion. Malachai's Dark Elves and allied Norscan raiders invade Ulthuan, and Tyrion has to foil Dark Elf assassins sent to kill the Everqueen. Tyrion and Teklus tangle with Nkari again while saving the Everqueen, and Teklus ends up transporting them to the shores of the Inner Sea and Finuvial Plain. Here Teklus will have a magical duel with Malekith that only ends when he invokes the Staff of Lilith, and in one final titanic burst of energy he overcomes the Witch King's defences and forces him to retreat to the Realm of Chaos. At this point Tyrion goes south to lift the siege of Lothern, and Teklus goes to the Old World accompanied by a couple of his fellow mages. Teklus is then instrumental in Magnus the Pious' victory at Kislev's gates. So what about the other elves? Prince Imric is protecting the slumbering dragons of Calador when the Dark Elves attack. Ali Thanar has been the Shadow King, having risen to power since Malekith first fled west. Eltharion is not likely to be the Warden of Tor Vires, and is over 100 years from leading his first notable raid on Naggarond. Speaking of Naggarond, let's check in on the Edgelord and his mummy. It's the end of the Age of Glorious Torment, and with Finnabar uniting the High Elves and making new friends, Malekith gets all pouty and stamps his feet, calling together Mummy Marathi and probably a few other names we know. Malekith pimps out his mum to the Northmen for their allegiance, and together they sweep into Ulthuan on the War of Vengeance that ends with Teklus going Super Saiyan and driving Malekith off to the Realm of Chaos. We've mentioned the Beastmen, so we've got Morgur the Shadowgave killed in 2247. Malagor the Dark Omen and Kazarak the One-Eye don't make appearances until much later on in the lore. At least any Beastmen fans have the completely different Morgrak, who doesn't even die when he's defeated by the Elf Alliance Friends Forever. So what about the Skaven? Skaven are seen as short-lived, but it's a trick of statistics. Because graphs are fun, the Cheeseboy survivorship curve looks like this, with your average Skaven slave living approximately as long as a bacteria, clan rats doing a little better, and your named Skaven possibly lasting for centuries. Ikit Claw was already in his first metallic romper suit after a lab cock-up in 2150. Skrolk was being sent all over the Old and New World by Lord Nurglish, so could pop up anywhere. Both of these have incredibly long lifespans for Skaven, as they're fueled by sorcerous warp cheddar or made out of mostly metal or scabs with hairs growing out of them. Our rats are also having some skirmishes with Cetra's Skelly Boys in 2250, but mostly they're expanding their tunnel networks and plotting the scheme to manifest the Horned Rat. The Council of 13 is reorganised after they do manage to summon the presence of their deity, and the Lords of Decay have to pass a trial of touching his pillar and proving they're chosen. Clan Rictus and Moors make the council at this point, but we won't see Tretch or Queek. We don't know much about the ninja rats, so Deathmaster Snitch may or may not make an appearance. Let's look at one of their key foes, the Dwarfs. The current High King is Alricsson. His father, High King Alric, died in a battle with a goblin warlord in 2205. We know that Alricsson wanted to see the Dwarfs take on a more active role in the Old World, but was, quickly, by Dwarf standards, drawn into events of the Great War against Chaos, that would see his sons all fall and him grievously wounded. This would lead to the eventual crowning of King Thorgrim Grudgebearer in 2305, following the year of deeds the candidates had been set upon at the Council of Kings. Thorgrim is Alricsson's nephew, and was being groomed to be a king in his own right in the years leading up to the Great War in Karaz-a-Karak. Ungrim Ironfist was a strong candidate for High King despite being youthful, and was potentially already the Slayer King in Karak-Kadrin. Belagar is still a prince. It's a little bit mucky here, but I think his father, King Belragar, is the one who is the candidate for High King. It's over 100 years before he begins his reconquest attempt of Karak 8 Peaks. So the Stunties are also at a pivotal point in their history at the end of the 23rd century. Gotrek could also be in the world as an engineer before the ill-fated trip to Karak Dum triggered the chain of events to him becoming voluntarily ginger. Grombrindle can pop up anywhere. So having done the Stunties, what about the Greenskins? Well, as you might expect, you're not going to see too many that we recognise. Gorbad Ironclaw is too early. He was last seen at the Battle of Blood Peak south of Blackfire Pass fighting the Dwarfs in 1712, and although not a confirmed kill, is surely a spent force. What about our other favourites? Thick Boy Grom rises to power in 2420, Skarsnik 2498, Azhag doesn't find the Crown of Sorcery till 2512, Grimgor we don't know anything, although he and his immortals are probably still a long time off wandering out of the Badlands. War Gutripper is in 2281, so we might have a new character there. Alright, the Undead. Starting with the Counts, and oh boy. The Undead have really taken a kicking just before this, so they're going to take a back seat. Vlad, Conrad, Isabella, and Manfred, they all die in the Vampire Wars. Vlad makes his move in 2010, and by 2051 is laying siege to Altdorf only to be betrayed by Manfred, who is Fantasy's Erebus, and die on the walls with Isabella committing Harry-Carry shortly after. Conrad is dominant in Sylvania by 2094, and Manfred tells which way the wind is blowing and gets the fuck out of Dodge on his nerd quest. Conrad's biggest achievement is getting the Splintered Empire to unite briefly in 2100 for the Battle of the Four Armies that saw Ludwig and Attila IV of Talabacaland order successful assassinations of each other, leaving Helmut of Marienburg the chief candidate to be emperor, until he turned out to be Conrad's meat puppet. Conrad meets his end in 2121 at Grim Moor, when an alliance of men and dwarves leads to him being pinned down by dwarf hero Gruffbad and pincushioned by a boy, Helmer, son of Helmut, the zombie emperor. With Conrad kebabbed on a runefang, Manfred heroically returns in 2122, but it isn't until the winter of 2132 that Manfred makes his move. With civil war again racking the empire, Manfred reached Altdorf to be thwarted, turned to Marienburg, thwarted again, and then basically played cat and mouse in and out of Sylvania until the Battle of Helfen in 2145, when he's cut to ribbons by Prince Martin, the Elector Count of Stirland, and sinks into the swamp, with the whole no body being found thing. Manfred currently doesn't re-emerge until 2522, but he's said to have watched the invasion of Azavar Kul with great interest, then travelled as far as Lamia and Nekikara to hone his magical skills. So maybe we could see Manfred making an appearance in some plotlines Erebusing it up. Krell is still resting up after his defeat at the Battle of Glacial Lake and has been for 2,500 years. Kemler won't find him until 2491. Speaking of old boy Nagash, he's slowly coalescing from black oily desert blobs. Arkan the Black is doing much better. He's bringing down Araby through his 1,000-year-long War of the Death. In the land of the Tomb Kings, Settra is awake but keeping most of the other Tomb Kings asleep, his lich priest holding fort long enough for Settra to ride in on his pimp wagon. Over in Lustria, Mazda Money and the remaining Slan read celestial portents and bolster the great warding that aids the Empire and High Elves in their respective wars in the usual way that lizardmen do, saving the world without anybody knowing. Krokgar and Grimlock have been recalled by the Magic Toad and are stomping around the jungle near Hexoatl. Luther Harkon will be sailing the high seas. It's been 700 years since he did anything of note though. And now we get to the Empire, and I've been avoiding it because it's a mess. So I'll try and get through really quickly. In 1152, Mandred Skavenslayer drove out the Cheese Boys and was assassinated for his trouble. The electoral system of the Empire fell apart and each province became pretty much sovereign. In 1359, the Count of Stirland was backed by the cult of Sigma to be elected Emperor. But Attila, the Elector Countess of Talabacland, contested this election and was backed up by the Church of Ulrich, proclaiming herself Empress and declaring a war on her main rival in Stirland. This started the line of the Attilian Emperors. The Count of Stirland invaded Talabacland but suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Talabek and never exerted his authority, so they were two emperors of a divided empire for 200 years. The elected emperors who were really chosen by the Grand Theogenist, and the Attilian emperors, hereditary successors of Attila I. In 1597 the situation got even worse, with the followers of Ulrich splitting their support from the Attilian emperor to Count Siegfried of Mittelland, forming a line of claimants known as the Wolf Emperors. Then there were other city-states that threw their lot in too, just to make everything even more munted. Fast forward to the Vampire Wars, and the three main claimants were Attilia III, Countess of Talabacland, who was succeeded during those wars by Attilia IV, who was assassinated in the Battle of the Four Armies, Ludwig, the Count of Reichland, who was succeeded by Ludwig, not the one on the map that we've seen, he was also assassinated in the Battle of the Four Armies, Helmut, Count of Marienburg, who turned out to be a zombie, he was succeeded by Helma, the one that skewers Conrad. But we know we're much later than that in the timeline, and some of those names in the Empire graphic have some pretty big Roman numerals after them. Anyway, this period will basically be the lifespan of Magnus the Pious as our protagonist, and ironically just before the birth of future antagonist, Diedrich Kastner, the man who will become the next Ever Chosen. And speaking of chaos, Sigvald makes an appearance in around 2350 with no evidence of him being fabulous during the Great War. Kolek though, Kolek helped break the resistance of the defenders at the Siege of Prague when he went all Godzilla through their walls. But our antagonist for Chaos and the foil for Magnus at all will be Azavar Kul, who rises to prominence with the barbarian Kurgan tribes sometime around 2271. By 2301, Azavar Kul the Anointed is warlord of the Kurgan, and soon he'll be sweeping down from the Chaos Wastes over the high pass to sack Prague. Azavar Kul and his rise will be another video. We've only got ogres and chaos dwarfs left really, and the answer again is who knows. Ogres we could see Greasus, Goldtooth or Scrag the Slaughterer, we just don't really know how long ogres will live for. Chaos dwarfs? Yeah, like GW are bringing them back soon. The century from the end of the Vampire Wars to the emergence of Azavar Kul and the eventual crowning of Magnus the Pious as Emperor of the United Empire is pivotal in the history of the Old World. It's close enough that we have familiar faces already rising to prominence in the long-lived races, or those with unnatural lifespans, but also plenty of room for new stories to be explored with new characters in the lore. There's huge gaps in the lore around this time, to the extent we don't even have firm dates for the Bretonnian kings that started this discussion. The Ordertide have an en masse change in leadership from Finnabar with the elves and Thorgrim to replace Auricsson. Lewin Orcslayer could well be about to be replaced, and the dates we have leave the opportunity for a twist or two in there too. I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at the old world and what our favourites might be up to in their future past. If you have, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more old world content. It means a lot when you do. Let me know in the comments if you're pumped for the old world and the return of fantasy. And I'll see you again, in the near future, where there is only war.